To tell you something about affect today, I have to tell you about the book I am writing called The Ends of Measure, Sociality, Subjectivity, and Datafication. One aim of the book is to develop the notion of the non-human unconscious as a matter of dissociated selves and as an aspect of the intuition expressed in the book, that the non-human turn in critical theory and philosophy has been born of human subjects discouraged with what thought has given, discouraged with the world, not so much unchanged by thought, but with the changes in the world with which thought has become or long has been enmeshed. There are reasons to despair, perhaps among those who most believed in the power of reason and in their power in being reasonable. And there also is potentiality in reasons giving way to worldly sensibility, given in these times as an awakening to the agencies and animacies of things, objects, and environments. Perhaps the subjects being born in this philosophical turn in critical thinking are being born of a felt despair and an intuited potentiality. They are being born unconsciously, born of a non-human unconsciousness, a matter of dissociation or dissociated selves. To tell you something about what I mean by the non-human unconscious as a matter of dissociated selves, I want to turn first to datafication, the datafication of 21st century media. That term, datafication of 21st century media, is a term I take from Mark Hansen to refer to the data mining of social media, tracking devices, biometric and environmental passive microsensors, or the bits of data that register molecular increments of behavior that are never an expression of lived human experience. As Hansen sees it, 21st century media has shifted media from addressing humans first and foremost to media registering the environmentality of the world itself, opening up human subjects to a worldly sensibility by re-embedding consciousness in a far richer context of the causally efficacious lineages that have produced it. That was a quote. The technically gathered data of the environment, or what Hansen calls the operational present or the technical present of sensibility. And I want to stop there just to say that the environmental sensibilities in the operational present sensibility tells you already that Hansen's interested in taking that environmental sensibility and seeing how it arrives to consciousness. So that's why the operational present of sensibility. And I'm interested in his work, at least in part because he's returned to the question of consciousness and subjectivity, given that technology. And I guess I'm interested in returning too. So the operational present of sensibility effectively represses consciousness, and in so doing, places consciousness in a complex compositional process involving digital techniques of data gathering and granular synthesis that facilitate the feeding forward, his term, of multiple experiential sources into a potential future of synthesis within consciousness, and all of that sort of quickly. As such, the present of consciousness is grasped or seen as an accomplishment that involves the coexistence of multiple experiential presence, multiple partially overlapping presence from different time frames and scales. Displacing consciousness as the stable, substantial hub of experience, the operational present of sensibility reconfigures the very sensory field in which our experience occurs. Rather than simply offering new contents to consciousness or new sensory affordances for us to enframe through our embodiment. As such, The operational present of sensibility also implicates the body, the human body, the body as organism. As 21st century media introduces a more porous and less self-referential conception of embodiment, quote, the body must be conceived instead as a society of microsensibilities themselves directly and atomically susceptible to technical capture. Not only is consciousness displaced, or better replaced as central to experience by the operational present of sensibility, so too is bodily based sense perception. And Hansen here has differences from a number of people I've also drawn on, Masumi and others, about emphasizing that it also displaces bodily based sense perception, producing experience that not only is precognitive or affective, but also, and more profoundly, is sub-perceptual. 21st century media deeply disturbs the taken for granted understanding of experience as human experience. For Hansen, then, 21st century media bring with them a troubling demotion of consciousness and humanly bodily sense perception that nonetheless and provocatively link 21st century media to current philosophical aims to displace human consciousness as the source of all agency, cognition, intentionality, if not in the name of a further deconstruction of the sovereign subject of Western modern thought, then in recognition of the non-human animal, objects, things, and environments. Yet Hansen's take on 21st century media differs from many of these philosophical discussions, especially those about affect, potentiality, and virtuality. He proposes that potentiality, rather than coming from an affective excess or virtuality, is instead in the, quote, contrast among already existing actualities, the real potentiality of the settled world at each moment of its becoming different with each new actuality or data. This is data's power to give rise to more data. Here, Hansen is drawing on Alfred North Whitehead, who argues, and I quote, that every actuality includes in its present feeling its potential to impact future actualities, but also that it feels the potentiality for the future in its present, and indeed as part of what constitutes the causal force of the present. Again, following Whitehead, and in his own reading of it, Hansen argues that the potentiality in the contrast among already existing actualities or data is their subjectivity, not the subjectivity of the sovereign subject of modern thought, but what Whitehead calls a superjective subjectivity, which, as Hansen would have it, is intrinsic to the sensory affordances that inhere in today's networks and media environments. And much of this echoes a lot of things that I have been thinking about, and so that's why I've been drawn to this work, and that provide the worldly sensibility antecedent to consciousness. As the future data will be produced on the basis of subjectivity or the superjective potentiality, as Whitehead argues, then Hansen concludes the connection between future and present proceeds by way of efficacy, or better, propensity, and not prediction. So the whole transformation going on about causality. But what of human subjectivity? Or how can the human subject be open to this worldly sensibility that consciousness cannot give or be given to without the compensation of datafication operated by contemporary techniques? What of the human subject, and what of psychoanalysis? In addressing these questions, the psychoanalysis I would like to begin with is not one about repression, as Freud and so many post-Freudians might emphasize. It is about objects, relations, prior to the coming into being of the subject of human consciousness and unconsciousness. It is a matter of what I want to call the non-human unconscious. The latter demands, I want to propose, a rethinking of unconscious memory and trauma as matters of radical dissociation. The psychoanalyst Harold Searles, writing in the late 1950s and early 1960s in his major work titled The Non-Human Environment, takes up schizophrenia and the non-human. And I'm not going to go on, but in this larger work, I distinguish the way he uses the schizophrenic from the way Deleuze does, for instance, or Gregory Bateson, also in that same period of time. Drawing on Donald Winnicott's transitional object, Searles points to Winnicott's insistence that the infant does not experience the object as coming from the outside world, but as coming from the infant, more as part of the infant's body, akin to the infant's experience of the mothering body. For Searles, the object is transitional, therefore, because it suggests both the indistinction for the infant of the human and the non-human, and the infant's transitioning to that very distinction of human and non-human as fantasy and reality come to be related in such a way that the non-human no longer seems adamant as it once did, surely before and even during the infant's transition. While Searles argues that the schizophrenic shows a variety of failures to establish the distinction between human and non-human, and therefore to establish the expected relationship between the two, he goes on to propose that the indistinction of human and non-human never fully ends for anyone, and is especially reinvigorated at various times in normal human development when the boundaries of identity are volatile, as for example, his example in adolescence. But we might also think of the volatility of boundaries of identity in relationship to cultural, social, political, and economic moments. Before going further into the relationship of the subject's receptivity to the datafication of 21st century media and the dissociation of the non-human unconscious, I want to make clear that I'm distinguishing the dissociation of the non-human unconscious not only from Freudian repression, but from Lacan's take on the drive, taken up by Jody Dean, who points to the unconscious drive, or better, what she refers to as the occlusion of the drive, in the denied pleasure of the repetitive interactions with social media and the like. I am also moving on from and away from what I once referred to as the unconscious of teletechnology in my book Autoaffection, while still holding to the argument there that changes in technology produce changes in the subject and the unconscious. Decidedly not Heideggerian thinking that the essence of technology is not technological. Differences in technology make a difference, an essential difference. So in taking up the dissociations of the non-human unconscious, I mean to contrast the human subject of 21st century media, as I've been talking about it, with the subject of Western modern thought, or the subject of 20th century media, where the timelessness of the unconscious gives depth to the always already loss of the present to the past, a seeming constant appearance of one now after another, or what we sometimes call modernity. Instead, the non-human unconscious is linked to an information-rich or glutted present, and I'm interested in the present as I was talking about it before from Whitehead, that shifts the subject from one form to another or one self-state to another, allowing for or even inciting dissociation in both problematic and unproblematic ways, thereby making the present a resource of potentiality as much as a site for delimiting that potentiality to a dissociated present. In what follows, I want to go further now and link the non-human unconscious to what psychoanalyst Sue Grand, following Harold Searles, refers to as the thing self-state, with a capacity for an it-it relationship. I want to suggest that this self-state, the thing self-state, can be aroused by 21st century media. The thing self state also enables me to rethink trauma and unconscious memory in a way that allows these to re-enter the treatment of 21st century media that is focused primarily on the potentiality of the present. Writing on the trauma of sexual abuse, Grand draws on Searles, arguing, as he does, that there is a non-human stratum to early self-experience that is an ongoing resource of attachment, beneficent or traumatic. She proposes that this early self-experience produces a thing self, or the capacity for an it-it relationship. As she puts it, thus what appears as a quasi-delusional imago of non-humanness might actually be a self-state that has always existed, but which is newly roused, in her case, by trauma. Carving out the it-it relationship from a description of a horrifying case of sexual abuse, Grand points to the relationship of the thing self to a disembodiment or an embodiment that is not human or is a body without a psychic skin. But refusing the equation of the skinned body with sanity, Grand rather points to the contingency of the body's being there or not in relationship to the I. She speculates that perhaps the I feeling can contract and expand to include or exclude the body, and thus is not simply derived from bodily states. Perhaps we have something like a non-human mental ego, contracted in relation to non-human culture and generative of both anxiety and centeredness. Grand proposes that if the psyche comes into being in relationship to human others, so it comes into being in relationship to the non-human world. Perhaps we all have a nascent thing self. Thinking of cultures that differ from modern Western culture and that offer support to the nascent thing self and the it-it relationship, Grand concludes that the it-it relationship can be a source of positive, cosmological, even ecstatic experience as much as traumatic experience. Grand does not speak to the animacies or the life of things themselves, but I would argue that it is the animacies of things that are the lure to feeling states that the non-human environment exerts. As such, love when as such, got that? As such, the it-it relationship is the correlate of the non-human unconscious, offering the human subject an unconscious capacity to be receptive to the sensory affordances given with 21st century media, evoking in the human subject different self-states, including the thing self-state. But in this, 21st century media may well be bringing forth a different sense of trauma, a matter taken up, I think, by Catherine Malibu, whose treatment of the radical exteriorization of trauma has informed Hanson's treatment of sensory affordances of 21st century media as radically exterior to consciousness. Actually, in his book, Feed Forward, he drops Malibu, but I was on a panel with him where he showed that relationship, so I remembered it. In her take on trauma, Malibu draws on patients with brain damage or with diseases such as Alzheimer's or PTSD. These diseases point to the radical externalization of trauma in contrast to the insistence in the psychoanalytic perspective that trauma is only traumatic when the exogamous or the outside event arouses endogamous internal states of the subject involving unconscious struggles over the sexual drive. This is Malibu. But for Malibu, what today's traumas indicates is an ongoing shift in the etiology of mental states from sexuality to cerebrality. By cerebrality, she means to point to the brain's autoaffection, or the brain's experience of its own functioning, affecting its ongoing change. The experience of its plasticity is an experience of the brain that is not possible for the conscious human subject. without technologies of expansion and intensification, for example, brain function visualization technologies. So these two people talking about these exteriorizations coming to the human through technology. It is this technology that has supported the cerebral etiology of mental states, as the cerebral event is understood by Malibu to coincide with the psychic event. From the perspective of cerebrality, Malibu offers a post-phenomenological description of trauma, focusing on the individual whose brain damage means that psyche and self are severed, or when the past self cannot be brought into the present or future. This cutting off of easy access or any access at all to past or future is what Malibu calls a destructive plasticity, a rewriting of the death drive as a force of annihilation and creativity, delivering, as I see it, the id, or the drives, from a repetition unto death, as Freud would have it, to a repetition that is a return to a dynamic, non-human, maybe in Deleuze's terms, a repetition with a difference. There is a lot that I should say here that I can't, because Malibu differs with Deleuze, and I'm drawn to Deleuze, but she has a point, and her point is resonant for me with some of the debates between us Deleuzians, I think of myself as, Whiteheadians, I think of myself trying to be always, and the object-oriented people who I have spent a considerable amount of time with, over the notion of when does something bind. So for Freud, the binding of the repetitions is very important. And there's some struggle between, like Whitehead and Deleuze, as I understand it, over when does something become an actuality or an occasion in Whitehead's. What does that mean versus flow and becoming? And so there's a lot to have to say there, because there's a lot of differences, and I'm flying over them. It's a very interesting question. I'm teaching a class right now, and students have been teaching me a lot about that myself, to me. As a force of annihilation and creativity, destructive plasticity results in a mutation of both content and form, not an elasticity of form, but plastic change of form. I think this is a very important point on Malibu's part about the way form and essence and being have to change, producing a subjective form that is constituted from the exhaustion of possibilities when all virtuality is left, when cohesion is destroyed. That's why the subject cannot connect to the past or the future, because everything's been destroyed, even though there's still psychic and psychic pain. And I don't have time now, but I've linked some of the language of Malibu to Randy Martin's notion of how the derivative is working right now, and how we could think of that as really moving us away from what we've been calling financialization and, God knows, neoliberalism. Malibu's description of destructive plasticity may not only give insight to subjects suffering brain lesions, but may also point to what is becoming a more ordinary experience of the subject's it-it relationship with 21st century media, when the human subject may experience the body's being there or not, when the connection between the self and psyche is lost, the present cut off from past and future for shorter and longer times. Given the radical externality of the conditions of consciousness brought with datafication, destructive plasticity points to the subject's relationship to 21st century media as having effects that are creative and transformative, the potentiality of and in the present, as well as effects that are chillingly frightening in the delimiting of the potentiality of the present to a dissociated present. After all, it is not to be forgotten that the patients to which Malibu refers are suffering, and Grand's elaboration of Searle's treatment of the non-human draws on a case of traumatic sexual abuse. It is for this reason that Grand describes the thing self as ungendered and unsexed. The thing self, quote, operates on a developmental track separate from the sex-gendered embodied organism-bodied self. And I would add that the non-human unconscious is separate from the human unconscious. That is to say, the usual sense of dissociation is one of dissociation of mind and body. But I'm also proposing a dissociation of the sex and gendered embodied self from the thing self, of the non-human unconscious, and of a body that is a society of microsensibilities, themselves directly and atomically susceptible to technical capture, questioning what gender and sexuality and other identity features we've thought of in terms of that. In this light, the thing self and the it relationship, if ungendered and unsexed, are nonetheless haunted, as is their theorization, by those who have been identified as thing or it, those who have been given non-human status as a matter of inhumanity, often a matter of sex, gender, and race abuse. Haunted by, but delivered from being reduced to sex, gender, or race, the conceptualization of the it relationship of the individual subject of 21st century media might be linked to trauma that Malibu finally describes as socio-political trauma. As she puts it, the victims of trauma such as war, captivity, and sexual abuse and more are among the new wounded, showing similar behavior to those suffering brain lesions. By no means simply reducing these traumas to neurology or neurobiology, Malibu is suggesting that these traumas be understood to be psychic blows stripped of all justification, of all signification. This extreme relational violence, Malibu suggests, makes the border between organic trauma and socio-political trauma porous, while the boundaries between history and nature blur, and those between neurobiology and sociopathy also do. A much-needed addendum, I think, to the now taken-for-granted treatment of biopolitics or neoliberalism. As the it relationship is linked to peoples with a history of trauma, it also points to the present of 21st century media as well, when the body's being more porous or without a skin, or when the I feeling can contract and expand to include or exclude the body, when these are both traumatic and revelatory in ways different for different populations in light of 21st century datafication. Here, the ends of humanity are its own inhumanity, but still not without potentiality or chance for another genre of humanity to come forth, as Sylvia Wynter would put it. I'm referencing Wynter here precisely because she conceives of genres of humanity as a complexification of the new wounding of race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and ability, rather than these being a mere reduction to identity or biological categories. There's a whole huge section here about sociality I'm now going to do in 2 seconds. In the ends of measure, because the questions that I raised with it seem more, great to hear what you'll say. In the ends of measure, I approached the study of the socio-political in light of 21st century media, referring at least to one person, Bruno Latour and his colleagues, who proposed that concepts thought to designate the social and the subject only are the products of technologies for producing and disseminating data. Or to put it as they do, specific and general, individual and collective, actor and system are not essential realities, but provisional terms, a consequence of the type of technology used for navigating inside data sets. For Latour and his colleagues, the effect of digitalized networks specifically is undoing the assumption of the whole constituted by interacting elements or a system metaphysics. And Randy Martin also in his work was beginning to think of what is beyond the system metaphysics, and so am I. They argue instead that there is more complexity in the elements than in the aggregates, or to state it a bit more provocatively, they claim that the whole is always smaller than its parts. This characteristic of a network is termed the one-level standpoint in contrast to the two-level standpoint of micro and macro levels of social structure. This provocative proposal, and I'm coming to the end, this provocative proposal that there is a relationship of methods for studying the social and for studying the subject, their resulting conceptualizations like individual and collective, and today's digital technologies for producing and disseminating data, not only points to a need to rethink subjectivity and sociality, but to recognize socio-political trauma, as Malibu describes it, in relationship to the collision of the inside and the outside, conditioned by the displacement of the two-level standpoint, by the one-level standpoint of the network, or the end of a system metaphysics. Trauma is the undoing of the difference of social and subject, the undoing of the difference of scale, a condition for theorizing the subject as dissociated selves, including the thing-self state, spreading out the personal through the thick and tender ties of the one-level standpoint of the network. I might have just said affect. I might have just said affect, but what I'm trying to get at here seems to me to move us from the theoretical environment in which affect first became of interest to many of us. And I more than realize that there are a number of lineages of thinking affect, and I've engaged affect through a number of these lineages: Raymond Williams, Larry Grossberg, Sarah Ahmed, Eve Sedgwick, Lauren Berlant, and Katie Stewart. But I'm thinking more specifically here, for starters, of Brian Masumi's The Autonomy of Affect, which I read in 1995 when it was first published in Cultural Critique, in which I thought, what is wrong with this man? I remember thinking. But its effect on intellectual circles, because it's not what was going on in 1995. It was first published. Its effects on intellectual circles would not be felt, I would say, until after Parables and surely after affect was linked to the political and economic situation of post-9/11, a situation that took many of us to surveillance, control, counterterrorism, not only after 9/11, but before it as well, to a worldwide study of the relationship of non-conscious, non-cognitive responses to technologies of governance and economy, implicating digital technologies, although not always was this made explicit. The tight link between the rise of affect and digital technologies. Brian's treatment of the working of fear, for example, in the changing relationship of economy and governance that would draw on Foucault's lectures of the 1970s, would bring affect in touch with neoliberalism and biopolitics and the shift from disciplined subjects to control of populations, and finally ontopolitics, or what Brian called an environmental power in the wake of Katrina, and with concern for weather and climate. In my own work, I also was interested in affect and labor, drawing on Negri, Hart, Lazzarato, and others, but more extending affect beyond the human body to affect at every scale of matter, which for me came through the inspirations of feminists, Luciana Parisi, Tiziana Terranova. I think the most important aspect of all this was the notion of a preemptive logic of governance in relationship to risk, financialization, and the worldwide working of the stock market, and led to rethinking about time and temporality, as Jasbir Puar would elaborate in her work, and as others would treat as moods of the post-2008 economy. In the ends of measure, I am moving through and from this 2008 moment, working with Randy Martin's work on the social logics of the derivative, as he calls it, interested in the way probabilities work. There's a whole bunch of stuff to say about probabilities, biology, Deleuze, rereading Difference in Repetition, what probabilities are, and I've always been interested in it as a sociologist. I think I just knocked my microphone off there. And in the algorithms for producing and analyzing big data and the treatment of probabilities in predictive analytics of big data, and recently in what Hansen has also referred to as probability in the wild, which has very interesting repercussions in that piece, I think appearing in Non-Human Reader, relationship to 21st century media. This is a shift in measuring that is not simply the shift to effective measure, as I have been exploring it for some time now, but really pre-effective, prior to consciousness, but also prior to bodily-based perception, the measure of a worldly sensibility in an environmental digital sensing. By making use of the concept of prehensive, and I'm not the first one to do it, and certainly not discussed enough in my paper, the influence of Luciano Parisi's work on my brain, concept of prehensive, I mean to suggest then that we are at a moment where measures and measuring are up against the potentiality of the present, the contrast of already existing actualities, that their feel of the future in the present, including the delimiting of this potentiality. However, no matter that efficiency of predictive analytics, there is always excess of sensibility in the present. This shift from the past-future circuit of preemption to the present-future circuit of prehension suggests a new regime of thought in the making, and that's why I'm not just doing affect. A reconfiguring of subjectivity and sociality in the introduction of non-human relationships, perhaps the it relationship of thing selves, and the dissociations of the non-human unconscious. Thank you.